Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast. My name is Paul Ellis, and I'm your host for these programs about developments in this fast-growing industry. In his role as General Manager of Sustainability Solutions at Microsoft, Mark Kroese leads a team that drives product, customer, and market development solutions to help Microsoft realize its goals of becoming a carbon-negative company. Mark Fischel is the carbon product lead at Novata. They're launching their brand new tool, the Novata Carbon Navigator, in January to radically improve the carbon reporting experience for Novata's private company platform partners. Both Marks have joined this third episode of the Sustainable Finance Podcast Novata series on Demystifying ESG to help our sustainability-focused investor audience and their companies follow the pathway to decarbonization. Hello, Mark, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast.
Good day, and thanks for including me in this. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
Yes, we're very glad that both of you could join us, and we're going to jump right into the questions because I know we're on a tight schedule. So first, I think we're going to do a little bit of groundwork to level set about decarbonization, which, as we all know, is notoriously complex. I'm going to go with Mark Fischel first, and Mark Kroese, if you have anything to add to Mark's answer for the first question, just to chime in when he's done. So, Mark Fischel, what are carbon emissions and how do companies measure them?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Paul. So, we all know, I suppose, that the actions that we take on a personal level have a corresponding carbon footprint. So whether that's taking a flight, eating a steak, etc. Similarly, all the activities that an organization undertakes, whether that's powering their offices or their factories, sending their employees on a business trip abroad, each of these also has a corresponding environmental impact. And that's what we would call the overall carbon footprint of a company. Now, I say carbon footprint, but confusingly, carbon is often used as a byword for all greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon dioxide. But ultimately, in terms of measuring them, in theory, the process is very simple. So you take a business activity. So, for example, someone driving a mile in a van, and you multiply that by the average carbon emissions for a mile driven in a van. And once you can combine those two, you get the corresponding carbon emissions for that activity. And those multiplication values that I just described, they're called emissions factors. And they exist for pretty much any business activity that you could think of. So ultimately, to work out the carbon emissions, all you need is all the business activities that you undertake, and match them up with all the different emissions factors you need. Combine the two, and then you've got your carbon footprint. So it's easy.
Well, it sounds pretty easy. The process does, Mark. But Mark Kroese, it must be incredibly complex to gather all that data with a company the size of Microsoft, isn't it?
It is. It's really hard for any company. Microsoft is arranged around vertical industries, but really carbon accounting is a horizontal data problem because the carbon accounting is a system of record that draws from other systems of record. In the case like SAP or an ERP system, and all of these things add up those business activities that Mark Fischel was talking about. The additional thing to mention is that carbon greenhouse gas, but we'll say carbon for the sake of simplicity. Carbon emissions are measured in what are called scopes. So you have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So scope 1 would be like all of the vans and shuttles driving around Microsoft campus. That would be stuff that is contained in our own bubble, right? Scope 2 would be power we need to buy from utilities, for example, to power our campuses and data centers. So energy consumption from third-party sources. And then scope 3 is everything else. So when you buy, and scope 3 has 15 subcategories if you want to get really wonky, but a couple of big ones. are purchased goods and services. So anything the company is buying, or capital goods. So think of concrete, steel. Think of building a data center. You have lots of purchased goods and services, and you have lots of capital goods that are being purchased. And so we have to take responsibility for the carbon emissions from the chip, for the electricity consumption of every Xbox user that was gaming through the night during the pandemic. All of those things are scope 3. So scope 3 becomes the ultimate sort of responsibility without authority problem, where you are taking responsibility. Microsoft's emissions are 96% scope 3. So this is often referred to as upstream and downstream supply chain emissions. Capital goods and purchased goods and services are upstream, things you need to do to, say, build a data center. And then use of sold product. So think of the electricity consumption from an Xbox user. We were taking responsibility for every amount of electricity that person is using to game on that system. That would be use of sold product. So it's about scope 3. 96% of our emissions are scope 3, and that's what makes it complex.
Got it. So, Mark Fischel. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Mark.
It's nested doll problem, right? But you say to your chip manufacturer, we need you to report your emissions and work with us to reduce those. And they say, well, we have 7 suppliers behind us, and they work with them, and they work with them, and so on and so forth.
Got it. So, Mark Fischel, now from Novata's perspective and your perspective, there's a lot of people and a lot of companies in scope 3 emissions along the supply chain, maybe at the distant end of it. How are you helping private market companies integrate all of this measurement into their greenhouse gas?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as Mark mentioned, scope 3 is a notoriously complex thing to unpack, but we like to think about it as taking companies on a journey to get more and more accurate. Right. So there's different levels of ways that you can do this. So you can start off by just looking at your expenditure ledger. So many of the things that Mark mentioned will flow through in your expenses. So that's expenditure with your cloud provider, expenditure on these goods, on construction, etc. And then once you've done that spend mapping, then you're in a much better position. You've sort of got a sketch of where the hotspots of your emissions are. And that's when you can take it to the next level deeper. You can actually reach out to that supplier, whether it's Microsoft or Amazon or your construction provider, and you can get real emissions data from them. So really, the way we think about it is taking companies on a journey. Many haven't even thought about measuring scope 3. So you can start with a spend-based approach, and then you can get it more accurate over time. And as you start getting it more accurate, then the key thing, and I think we'll get onto it, is moving away from just measurement to also reporting on your emissions to various different stakeholders, and crucially, the holy grail of actually starting to decarbonize.
Okay. Now, Mark Kroese, back to you to start this next question. There's 3 phrases that are used within the field of carbon emissions when you're talking about it and writing about it. And if you could just give us an introduction to each of those. We're talking about net zero, science-based targets, and being carbon negative.
Yeah. So you'll also, and I would throw net zero and carbon neutral sort of in the same thing. The key word here is net zero. So if a company has, say, I'll be simplistic, 100 or 1,000 metric tons of emissions, it must first try to reduce. There are really two reduce their emissions. So buying lower carbon steel for their construction, lower carbon concrete, making sure their software code runs more efficiently, just to have fewer emissions. But there's a point, like an airline. Let's take an airline. They could choose to use sustainable aviation fuel, a huge source of airline emissions, but that's not going to get them to zero. So the net comes to say, okay, you get your emissions from 1,000 down to 600 or 400. You now have 400 left to get to net zero. Those need to be removed. And that would be the field of carbon removal, which is planting a net new tree, right? So the economic concept of additionality, it wouldn't have happened otherwise, but for this activity. So planting a net new tree or using direct air capture to say suck vacuum carbon out of the atmosphere. These are removal activities that are removing legacy emissions from the atmosphere. So when a company has 1,000 metric tons of emissions, they can reduce, say 60%, and then they can remove the last 40%. That gets you to a net of zero. Carbon neutral and net zero are sort of used interchangeably. There's some nuances between them that, I'll sort of skip over. Carbon negative, of course, would be to make sure that the net is a net negative. So in the case of this company with 1,000, you reduce by 600, but then you remove, say, 500, and now you have a net negative of 100. Microsoft has made the commitment to be carbon negative by 2030. And that generally, going back to our two verbs, reduce and remove, that means we are going to reduce our scope 3 emissions by 55% and durably remove the rest so that, and then with each subsequent year between 2030 and 2050, going slightly more negative every year so that by 2050, we have now accounted for all the emissions from the founding of the company in 1975 up to 2020 when we made that commitment, so that from an atmospheric perspective, by 2050, it's as if Microsoft never existed. So we're going to sweep up all our historical emissions by being slightly more negative every year. That is a very, very tall order and something that is even more challenged in the world of AI.
Okay. Now, Mark Kroese, we're going to stay with you, first of all, for this next question. When it comes to tracking and regulating carbon emissions or any other form of greenhouse gas emissions, what's the big deal that's been brewing for the last probably decade or so, and we're starting to see it manifest in business, in the business world on a day-to-day basis now?
Yep. So we're in this grand trend from voluntary to regulatory compliance. That's the simplistic way of saying it, is that leading companies, whether it's Microsoft or any of our peer companies or celebrated companies like Patagonia, have been doing this voluntarily because it's the right thing to do and they want to be good stewards and citizens of the planet, which is great. Now, and that let's call that the early leading edge, right? As you get to the full majority and the laggards, there are people that are less motivated to do that. So what you're seeing at a governmental level is regulation coming that will require companies to report their emissions. The thinking being, as Mark Fischel was saying, once you report and get all that information together, you can then analyze it and figure out what to do about it. Right. So a couple of notable regulatory requirements that are coming. The first is coming very soon, or the first really big one is called CSRD. That is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that's coming out of the European Commission in Brussels, and it affects 50,000 companies, all companies with over $20 million of revenue or 20 million euros of revenue in the EU. And any company that deals with the EU, like Microsoft, has way more than $20 million of revenue in the EU. So we are affected as well. So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive will require 1,144 fields of data across not just environmental, the E in ESG, but social and governance as well, which is why a tool like Novata is so great, because it is an all-in-one dashboard. Microsoft has a similar thing at an enterprise level called the Cloud for Sustainability. But you need a place and a dashboard to put all of your E, all of your S, and all of your governmental fields of data. And so CSRD is coming fast and furious, affecting 50,000 companies. And the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC, is planning to follow suit with similar regulations here in the United States. So regulation is coming, and companies need to get their data house in order to comply with this new era of regulatory compliance that we're entering.
So, Mark Fischel, now on the private side of the ledger, give us where things are right now in the development of the business case for measuring, reporting, and reducing emissions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the key point is that now more than ever, there's a very, very strong business case for getting to grips with your carbon emissions and your environmental, all environmental and social and governance, as Mark mentioned. I think to unpack why and how that is, I think there's really four main reasons. So first of all, the regulatory piece, as Mark mentioned, I won't go through it again, but there are certain jurisdictions where you literally won't be able to do business in the next few years if you're not getting to grips with this. So that's a pretty big push. Secondly, there's obviously this broader piece and something that your listeners will be very familiar with, Paul, which is access to capital. The old phrase, show me the money. Well, the thing is, if you want to do a capital raise, equity or credit in the next, 5 years, you're probably, if you're not doing this, you're going to close off doors and you're going to close off pools of capital that you want to have access to. So that's the second piece. I think the third piece really that I would point to is really around cost savings. There are these parts of business where it turns out being wasteful, you can stop being wasteful and you can save on carbon emissions. You can also save on the bottom line. So things like energy efficiency, for example, that's a real win-win, both from a cost perspective and from an emissions perspective. And then finally, I think the fourth one, moving away from cost, there's also just a huge business opportunity here, right? Coming back to the scope 3 piece that we mentioned right off the bat, if Fortune 500 companies across the globe have to reduce their scope 3 emissions. So 80% of that is in their supply chains. So they are just cascading that down to their suppliers. They are compelling anyone who wants to do business with them to really, certainly measure their emissions, ultimately probably also set targets to reduce and actively reduce their emissions too. So if you're a B2B company and you want to sell to Fortune 500 companies, which is, most B2B companies, then you should really get your house in order on this. And I think the key thing is that it's not a cost center, right? It's a real opportunity. If you can get ahead of the curve and ahead of your competitors, it can be a real point of difference when you come into RFPs with potential customers like Microsoft, etc.
Okay, so now let's move on to carbon measurement software options. And Mark Kroese, I'll ask you to go first on this one. Microsoft has its own software measurement system, right? And I believe it was recently ranked among the top 5 in the industry. What are the other options that are out there? And is company size a consideration when it comes to making a choice about the software they use?
It is. The bigger the company, the more complex your supply chain, the more of a carbon ledger you have, right? So Microsoft introduced over a year ago what's called the Microsoft Cloud for Sustainability, which is really meant in-house dashboard for all of the company's reduction and removal activities that really defines a ledger. This would include the life cycle of, say, a carbon credit. So if you are offsetting an emission that you can't reduce on the removal side, and you purchase a carbon removal credit from, say, a forest in California, and then that forest ends up burning down, there's a reversal of that credit because the avoided emissions are then now back up into the atmosphere. So, software needs to be very sophisticated with lots of metadata to be able to account for these ebbs and flows in the emissions. The most important part is on the reduction side. So if you think of a company like Microsoft, we have 15 business groups, and each of those have different emissions coming. So the Xbox team and the Surface team have embodied carbon from the production of the metal casing of the device and so forth. All of those have to come into a centralized place. They all have to be viewed. And various reduction activities then are recommendations come from all of those. And that's all in one big place. And then we add to that all of the social and the governance factors. So, employee diversity, all of those types of data and corporate governance data. So it's all in one place so that all of the reporting that is coming at us can happen. There are a number of companies like Persephone and Watershed and SAP, Salesforce.com, that all have entered this space in slightly different, nuanced ways. We think it's a great thing because it's kind of a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. We're all forcing ourselves. We're all pushing each other to get better. And that's at like the big enterprise level. And then at the more private and smaller company level, you have companies like Novata, who seems to be really running away with it, as a simpler, more TurboTax-ish way for a smaller company that's less sophisticated and doesn't have an army of data scientists to enter into this idea of recording all of your emissions into one place, all of your ESG data in one place.
Okay, Mark Fischel, anything to add?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, that's a good segue. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. There's no one size fits all for how you tackle this. It depends on the company in question. And there are some really great tools out there, like the Microsoft Stability Manager and many others. But yeah, in terms of what we're doing at Novata, as Mark alluded to, we're launching our own in-house Novata Carbon Navigator in January. And this tool is designed to radically improve the carbon experience for really mid-sized private companies. So it's fully digitally integrated, it's transparent, it's robust, and crucially, it's very easy to use. So that's as Mark alluded to, that is a real improvement for mid-sized companies, who don't have a huge sustainability department, but really need to get to grips with carbon ASAP. If listeners are interested in learning more about that, please do reach out, and I'd be delighted to talk more about it. But that's kind of where we're at in terms of our carbon offering, and that, as Mark mentioned again, sits alongside the S and the G elements of the platform as well.
Okay, now back to you, Mark Kroese, to start this next question. But I got to say that this is the one that just blows my mind because there's so many new technologies coming out in this whole field. It seems like every week I'm reading about new companies, startups, launches, et cetera, et cetera. How is carbon accounting technology changing based on the development of other new technologies? And we'll just use AI as the prime example.
Yeah, it's interesting. We use the word carbon accounting. Really, what has been happening historically is carbon counting, not accounting.
Okay.
We count carbon. So we really, as an industry, we need to move from a world of carbon counting to carbon accounting. There's a lot of advancements happening at the software level, at the AI level. Let's just start with methodologies. The way in which you decide as a company what your emissions are is currently based on what's called the spend-based methodology. So let's take a Microsoft building, for example. The built environment is a big source of emissions. So let's say we spend $1 million on HVAC. What happens then is that we get an invoice that comes to our finance department that says, oh, you spent $1 million on HVAC. And then they go to a lookup table and they say, what is the average amount of carbon associated with $1 million of HVAC based on all companies in all industries across the world? That average doesn't appreciate that we are buying 100% renewable energy. It doesn't appreciate that we might have more efficient systems. It's just an average. So then that average is applied and it is a spend base. So it says, well, Microsoft, since you spent $1 million on HVAC, we are going to apply this emissions factor to that. And you're on the books, you're going to go to have this much carbon footprint from that $1 million spend. What we need to move to is an activity based. So let's take a company like Honeywell or Johnson Controls. We're working closely with both companies. Every time a meter, an HVAC device, a system in a building spins up and moves, it knows, is the grid green that it's getting that energy from? When did it go on? When did it go off? And all of that data is being pumped straight to the cloud. So that would be, it's much more accurate, right? That would be activity-based methodology versus spend-based methodology. So the first thing that needs to happen is but all of those devices, of course, have to be in place. They have to talk to each other, and the data formats, the file formats, and the protocols all have to be in sync. So the other thing that we're really working on is through an industry initiative that we helped launch and then turned over to a nonprofit, the Climate Works Foundation, is called the Carbon Call. And this is a standardization of carbon accounting methodologies and file formats across the world. The simple analogy I would use is the JPEG file. You have a phone, you take pictures, you text them to your friends, you post them on social media. The JPEG file is the same. I can receive it, you can send it. It is the same for everybody. And it has democratized the exchange of that file format across the world. We need the same thing. It's much more complicated than that, but we need the same thing for carbon accounting data. We needed, so there's this thing called the XBRL format and lots of different gobbledygook, but essentially it is a common file format with a common set of metadata constructs that track the chain of custody of a carbon credit and the life cycle of an emission all the way up and down the supply chain. So the two words we use on carbon accounting are the data needs to be more reliable, again, activity versus spend-based, and it needs to be more interoperable. It needs to move up and down the supply chain across companies and across industries with full fidelity. So I'll stop there, but and of course, AI is helping root out all of that and look for inconsistencies in the data and clean data up, and cleanse and conform it. And it is a huge accelerant to the progress on this whole thing.
Okay, so this last question is for both of you, and let's start with Mark Fischel. I'm almost afraid to ask this one. Beyond measurement, what's important to consider when it comes to reducing company emissions?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Paul. So I think that as with measurement, when it comes to decarbonization, it's straightforward in theory, but it can become, endlessly nuanced given the particulars of any specific business or industry they're in, where they operate, etc. But I think as some general principles, I think number one, it's good to start with the things that you can control. So coming back to scope 1 and 2, you should get your own house in order. You should be switching to renewables. You should be making your fleet of vehicles more efficient. The things that you have day-to-day control over, you should start there. And then secondly, I think more broadly, there's a piece around, prioritization here, right? And a lot of the process of the measurement is to really identify where are the material areas, where are the areas that your business has an outsized emissions hotspot where you can start making, strides quickly. And so focusing on that, you can't change everything all at once. So those are two practical pieces of advice. And I think then there's a third, slightly more overarching piece, which is that, you need, if you're a head of sustainability or head of ESG leading the charge on this, you need to bring everyone along on the journey with you, right? It's from the finance team to the marketing team to procurement. This is going to be a multi-year transformational project. So you need to be a good storyteller. You need to make the business case. That decarbonization is not just a nice to have. It's not just a good thing to do. It's crucial for the health of your long-term business opportunities. So those are some thoughts, but it's a difficult challenge, but one that everyone's coming to terms with at the moment.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark Kroese. What would you like to add to that?
Yeah, Mark Fischel covered it well. The one thing I would add is just that the rise of importance of corporate procurement really comes to focus here. So we have a group that, say, buys concrete for the construction of a data center. That team needs to be incented and steeped in making good choices. So the choice of materials and the choice of suppliers. So, about a third of global emissions, even a little bit more, come from the built environment. This is the management of existing buildings and the construction of new buildings. So we have our Climate Innovation Fund recently invested in a company based in Boulder, Colorado called Prometheus Materials. They make zero carbon concrete that's made from algae and bugs, and it's a crazy cool process. It's more expensive. Yeah. Right. And there's a short-term green premium, but when you overlay the carbon fee that we levy on businesses internally, it's about a wash. So making good choices of materials that drive the progress of your business, whether you're Procter & Gamble, whether that's just different packaging, or McDonald's and no styrofoam, or you need, or a Microsoft building a data center, you need to choose better materials and invest in the market to have those materials come online sooner. And this is another place AI is going to be a huge accelerant, is the creation and the ability to produce more sustainable materials, the raw materials for all of the things we build in this world.
Okay, well, listen, I know I'm going to have to listen to this program a number of times before I talk to anybody else about it. But Mark Kroese and Mark Fischel, where is the best place online for followers of the Sustainable Finance Podcast to learn more, first of all, about Microsoft's and Novata's approach to measuring carbon emissions on the pathway to decarbonization? And how can our listeners contact you with questions about the things that we've discussed in today's episode? Either one of you can go first.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So the single document that I would seek out is the Microsoft Sustainability Report. So if you go into your favorite search engine, you can just type in, Microsoft 2023 Sustainability Report or 2022 Sustainability Report, and you can get it it's about a 80-page PDF that you can download, and it will tell you everything about what we've been up to across all scopes and across all parts of our business, across all spheres of influence. You could also get ChatGPT to say, just summarize it for me, and you do that as well. So that would be the place. That is the sole source of, or the best single source of Microsoft's data and story around sustainability.
Okay, thank you. Mark Fischel, what about Novata?
Yeah, so on the Novata side, I'd say two places. Obviously, our website, www.novata.com, but also our LinkedIn page is very active as well. So we'll be posting lots of updates there about various different things. And then in terms of me personally, I'm also open. Listeners can reach out to me directly through LinkedIn. That's probably the best place.
Okay. Listen, I'm really excited to know that I can create my own executive summary of any one of these reports just by asking for that help. And I really want to thank both of you for joining us today. Thanks again to Mark Kroese of Microsoft and Mark Fischel of Novata for joining me in this episode of the Sustainable Finance Podcast and Novata series. And to our followers, join us again next week for another episode. My name is Paul Ellis, and this is the Sustainable Finance Podcast.